You wrote a Bloomberg View piece this morning. We were quoting it as well, where you said, quote, the longer the volatility lasts, the more likely it is to be accompanied by a durable decline in markets overall. In the context of this, though, Mohamed, it's interesting to note, though, if you look at the actual VIX index, right, the volatility index, we're not anywhere near our August sell-off. So what kind of volatility are you talking about, Mohamed?
So we're not there yet in terms of the VIX, but we are in a regime of higher volatility with components of what I call, and others have called, volatile volatility. So think of it as squared. And that will cause deleveraging in the system, and it will do so in the context of limited liquidity. So what people should expect is more volatility, more ups and downs like we've seen this week, with a bias to the downside until you can identify new buyers in size.
Right, and so, you know, we were talking with Oliver Rennick, our stocks reporter, and he's like, you know, no one's saying yet, buy on the dip here, buy on the dip. But, you know, do we have to wait until oil prices basically stabilize before we see this as a buying opportunity?
Look, I'm not a buyer of the strong connection between oil and equity. I think both of them are responding to something much bigger. And they're responding first to doubts about global economic growth. Second, they're responding to valuations that had been decoupled from fundamentals, and therefore they were vulnerable. And thirdly, they are responding to very specific things, which in the case of oil is the loss of the swing producer in OPEC. So rather than say it's oil pushing energy, it's pushing equities, and equity pushing oil, I think both of them are responding to something much bigger.
And who's responding more rationally?
So I think the equity market so far is more rational. The most rational has been the fixed income market, which has been signaling for a while concerned about low growth. So that has been the most rational. And you have certain components, you and I have been talking about it for weeks and months, that are completely unhinged. Oil, elements of emerging markets, elements of a high yield, they're completely unhinged, so they are technically dominated rather than fundamentally dominated.
So you have to imagine, right, Mohamed, I mean, you're about to come out with a book that focuses on central bank policy. You've got to imagine the central bankers around the world really watching carefully day by day what's happening. John Williams, the San Francisco Fed president, made a speech earlier, and Mohamed, I want you to listen to what he said about, you know, the rate path given this volatility.
That doesn't mean we're going to do 4 funds rate increases in 2016, 2017, because we're not that good, as we were reminded earlier, at forecasting. And so what happens is the economy doesn't always play out the way we expect it. So our policy is going to be gradual, but it's going to be data dependent.
Okay, so you hear that word again, data dependent, Mohamed. But the fact of the matter is, though, the Fed has been repeatedly almost too optimistic. Their forecasts have been off by being too bullish about the economy. Are they really looking at the right data and evaluating it correctly? And should they be still on a rate hike path?
You know, Betty, if you look only at the economic data, then they should be on a path for further hikes. I don't think they'll do 3 or 4 this year. I think they'll do 2. But the economy has not been contaminated as yet by what's happening in the financial sector. So the question becomes, should they respond to the financial sector? And that is what's really hard, because in the past, every time they've responded to financial volatility, they've made the underlying situation worse. They've decoupled prices further from the fundamentals. So I think this time around, they're going to be focused much more on the economy. Yes, they are data dependent, but they're data dependent about the economy, whereas in the past, they were very sensitive to financial volatility.
Right, but should they be now? I mean, given what we see in the first 15 days here, should they be more sensitive now?
I don't think that we had a choice but to transition at some point from a very artificial regime of suppressed volatility to one of more normal volatility. Now, that transition will never be painless. It will be incredibly bumpy. But it doesn't mean you stay in an artificial mode in which you're causing damage as well as benefit. You know, when Bernanke embarked on QE2 in August, he said, August 2010, he said something very important. He said it's about, quote, benefits, costs, and risks. And the longer you stay in this artificial experimental regime,
right,
the lower the benefits, the higher the cost and risk. So we had to transition at some point, and of course it was going to be bumpy. But that's part of what a transition is about.
Mohamed, I've got to just ask you this point blank. Are we headed into a recession, though?
So you asked me that a few months ago. I said the probability of recession in 2017 was 30%. People thought that was a really high number. I still think it's about 30%. I do not think it's the baseline.
So this is in 2017. In 2017, 30%.
In 2017. I think this year we'll get the 2% growth. I think the real question is, do we get the recession in 2017? And I think it's about a 30% probability. I haven't changed my assessment on that.
Why not?
Because I think people underestimate the resilience of this economy. You know, that first, we have become an employment machine. We've created almost 6 million jobs in the last 2 years, well into the recovery. Second, there's a ton of cash on the sideline that's not yet deployed in productive and offensive reasons, as I call it. Third, there's exciting stuff going on the technology side. So I don't think that we should give up on the economy, but what we need to do is normalize financial markets that had been excessively decoupled from fundamentals.